Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 2nd of April. Today's video will be very interesting as we are once again starting off with frontline updates, including the capture of a village in Zaporizhia, continued advances towards the Dnipro border, developments around Pokrovsk, including an analysis of new trenches built by the Ukrainians during the March 2025 period. We'll look at Touretsk, I believe, and at the Kharkiv region, and we'll finish off the video by looking at a couple of sanctions announced by the American Treasury Department in relation to Russia and a meeting that's supposed to be held between several European nations that may be looking at a potential peacekeeping force. They're going to discuss that issue with the Ukrainians this Friday. So we're going to get into all those details in today's video. But let's begin by zooming in on Zaporizhia, where we have just an elaboration off of what we talked about yesterday. Russian forces have been able to capture 7.4 square kilometers of territory, largely open fields that were in an exposed position anyways. And so there were not many Ukrainian soldiers over here for a couple of days now, but now you actually have the solidification of control over these territories, including the full capture of Lobkove. So you have over here the agricultural warehouses and the road leading northwards to Stepove fully under Russian control, along with the residential areas. And we do have April 2nd, so this is a very recent video, a video from Russia's 247th Regiment where they captured the town along with four Ukrainian soldiers, three of them coming out of a basement, one of them surrendered to a drone in a trench. So there were a couple of fortifications that were also cleared around here. And let's see where the regiment is located. I have them over here, a VDB regiment that I previously had marked operating a bit to the southeast of Orikhiv, but it appears that a lot of the resources the Russians had diverted to this Orikhiv crescent have been moved a bit to the west to engage with the momentum and just exacerbates the already existing gains that the Russians have been able to achieve. So now I would say it's pretty accurate to say that Lobkove is under full Russian control. Now the question is where the Russians will go from here, because looking northwards, you have a chunk of territory spanning, what is this, 5 kilometers at least, that just consists of open fields. There are ditches over here, so it's not the simplest area to advance through. And there are also Ukrainian drone crews that will strike individual Russian soldiers that try to reach deeper, push through tree lines. So it's definitely not a walk in the park to reach an area like Pavlivka or Novoyakovlivka. And upon reaching these trenches, the Ukrainians had 2 years of preparation in some of these regions to build up trenches. And then really the question is how much infantry there actually is and whether or not it's sufficient to actually hold on to this entire perimeter. Because if they do have the sufficient manpower, then dragging out fighting over here could be extremely effective and would work to prevent frontal assaults. In terms of just more local objectives, because we are still looking at smaller scale Russian advances, we're not seeing any sort of commitment coming from outside fronts. It's just the same general sector, including Orkhiv and the sort of region near the Dnieper River. And all those resources are being pooled together to, play a role in this current Russian attack. Not anything more than that. And so for the time being, it is still a localized attack and localized offensive activities. That being said, though, you do have an opportunity now from a Russian perspective to continue pushing eastwards from the east to the west, entering into some of these residential areas and fully clearing out Kamyanske, which acts as a forward Ukrainian operating node, really to project power towards the rest of the valley, leading to areas like Vasilivka and the entire Russian Surovikin line and logistics system from Tokmak to the line of contact. So it is an important forward base and also is an area that runs along a vertical highway, of course, leading to Zaporizhia. So there are various reasons why it would be important. But at the same time, I've been consistently warning about the possibility of the Russians then turning their attention eastwards along this highway and reaching an area like Novoandrivka and the western outskirts of Orkhiv. They are right now 12 kilometers away, as I said in yesterday's video, and there is a heightened possibility of that occurring. And so we'll be keeping an eye out for where the Russians decide to turn their offensive actions towards in the near future. But let's just move on to the situation in Velika Novosilka. There is a minor update from here. You can see that north of Bulatske, the Russian forces have captured 1.4 square kilometers of territory. The Sicario drone units, it's a UAV team that has recently popped up in this region. They destroyed two Russian BMP-1s along with several Russian dismounts that were located along this tree line. So once again, you're seeing positional movement in the same concentrated area that I've discussed as being the hottest parts of the 20-kilometer wide Velika Novosilka sector, but only about 5 kilometers are actually, the most heated areas where you see the most shelling and the most casualties on a daily basis. Looking northwards at the Dnipro border, over here you have once again movement, and this includes new movements and also ones that I just didn't note in my previous video because I was not aware of the footage to back up certain claims. So for instance, Preobrazhenko, I said that I didn't have proof of it being under Russian control, but I looked back at the record and saw that there were geolocated videos of Ukrainian drone crews, and I'll list out the units involved, including the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, but not just that, drone crews from the 59th Assault Brigade and the 414th Unmanned Aerial Systems Brigade, which is, of course, the Birds of Magyar units, along with certain battalions and drone crews of the 35th Marine Brigade, maybe also 38th, but to a lesser degree. And you also have the 91st Separate Anti-Tank Battalion. So they've been engaged in a lot of fighting back against Russian armored columns that have recently sprung up over here and have made a sort of comeback. There's also the Consolidated Rifle Brigade of the Air Force. They were moved from the Vovchansk region a couple of months ago to operate around here. So you do have a sizable Ukrainian garrison. The issue for them is, as I've noted numerous times, is that although on paper, and again, I have to stress that it's on paper, they do have a sizable contingent over here. They don't have any good locations near the front line to organize. The best, I suppose, the closest area that they could sort of pull resources from and remain as a rear base in would be Novopavlivka to the west over here. The issue is in between Novopavlivka and the current line of contact, which at least is 9 kilometers, but at most is around 14. You don't have anything of note, any areas where the Ukrainians can remain situated in a sort of safe setting. Of course, in relative terms, you only have these two frontline villages that are extremely small, not multiple floors, very difficult to, huddle a lot of soldiers there to keep them concentrated in a single area. And we're talking about multiple brigades and battalions operating around here. So there simply isn't the infrastructure in place to house and to keep all of these Ukrainian soldiers safe for an extended stay and to drag out fighting. You do have the unified trench line that was built running along the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, and that is the silver lining for the Ukrainian side. But after that point, there is an open course. There are not many trenches in between that and Novopavlivka because there was not an opportunity to fully build it up yet. And then Novopavlivka being threatened would have much broader implications for the Ukrainian garrison in southern Donetsk, including areas like Komar and the entire Mokreli River Valley, which is, I believe, a reason why the Russians are attacking over here. They see an opportunity to seize the initiative. And I believe they have been accumulating armored vehicles for this specific purpose because we saw generally in the Donetsk region, but especially between, say, Pokrovsk and, I don't know, the area around Andrivka, this entire region just has had a chronic lack of Russian armored assaults over the past couple of months, throughout the entirety of 2025, actually. And that's probably because the Russians were building up a stockpile of MTLBs and of more modern tanks, T-72 and onwards, and various other stronger armored vehicles that could actually take and absorb damage from nearby shelling, shrapnel, from FPV drones because they would have better protection from them, better armor. And now a lot of that is being utilized with the hopes of achieving maximal gains along this part of the front line that really is conducive for those sort of advances because it is an area that is largely open. And it's something I continually stressed at the beginning of the year when the Ukrainians were sort of taking it for granted that they are in control of these open fields, including areas that are currently south of Bohdanivka. They're still located over here, which is, of course, a positive for them. And now there actually is a high density of Ukrainian soldiers. But let's say you went back 4 months, you would see that the Ukrainian troop concentrations over here were very low. And same thing with all the locations a bit to the north. There was a lack of emphasis on these regions, and it gave the Russians an opportunity to fill that vacuum and push forward. And now you're already seeing a more cohesive Ukrainian defensive framework, but it's not enough to entirely stop the pace of Russian advances. And with that being said, a lot of the Russian armored resources have been directed towards Bodanivka, being one of these villages. And you can see over here on April 1st, the Bulava drone unit struck several armored vehicles south of Bodanivka, indicating a 1.7 square kilometer advance. So that's about it for now. I do want to do a more detailed topographic analysis of that part of the front line. So hopefully get to that in the coming days. Let's move on. I want to see where else there's an interesting update. And with that being said, we have over here the Russians infiltrating into almost all of Alexandropil and Panteleimon. Long name. So 68th Tank Regiment, they were involved in this assault, pushing from east to west, taking over on April 1st most of the town and raising their flag over there. The western portion may either be a gray zone or still under Ukrainian control, but this is an area that's been a tough nut to crack. The Russians have not devoted a lot of resources to remaining over here, and neither of the Ukrainians, in all honesty, the Ukrainians have not committed a large force contingent, but the small garrison that remained here was steadfast in their defense and refused to budge despite really difficult shelling. Not really ground operations, but they definitely did endure a lot of shelling. And as a result, they were able to retain this forward crescent, which spans all the way, and I'll mark it with red over here, from Zelenopole to the chain of villages starting with Sukhabalka. This is an area that is really well built, and it's an area the Ukrainians succeeded in stabilizing the front line after the debacle last year with Ocheratina collapsing, and the Ukrainians were able to just regroup around several, I suppose, areas that lack roads for Russian advances, but then also are difficult because the Ukrainians have a lack of roads for their logistics and their rear. You see over here that there was and still is a huge density of dugouts and trenches, which helped the Ukrainians stabilize the situation. And more generally, the Russians shifted their focus elsewhere to areas like Toretsk and Pokrovsk. And so the open fields and the villages in between that were a bit less important, they sort of fell through the cracks and remained under Ukrainian control. But now there is an opportunity to flank them and begin to chip away at them due to the renewed Russian vigor in the Toretsk region with the capture of areas from Yurivka all the way up to Leonidivka. So Russian forces are directly attacking from the east and taking over some of these villages, including 2 square kilometers in this village to the north, and in Alexandropil also nearly 2 square kilometers. So the Ukrainian garrison over here is sort of solidifying and falling back to Sukhabalka, but now it is getting enveloped on multiple sides, meaning it would be difficult to resist around here. And it means that going forward in the next couple of months, the Russians will have the ability to advance from the east to the west and really pose a significant threat to these areas that have been long-standing villages and pillars of the Ukrainian front line, most notably areas like Kalinove and Stara Mykolaievka, all with the objective, and this is something that, again, I will continue reiterating, not because there is indication of it happening, there isn't yet, but because it just seems to me logical looking at the map and looking at areas where there are gaps in Ukrainian trenches, areas where there are high elevated points. You can see over here, this is a massive hill region, really high ridge that overlooks the highway to the west and overlooks the chain of villages under Ukrainian control north of Toretsk to the east. And it's an area that definitely the Russians could take advantage of, and I'll get to why in a moment, but it would unify the Toretsk and the Pokrovsk sort of vectors of attack for the Russians and give them the base needed to attack towards Konstantinivka throughout the course of 2025, going later on into 2025. But first, of course, the Russians have to deal with clearing out their perimeter in Toretsk, which they have not done yet. They're still involved in positional fighting with the tight-knit Ukrainian garrison that has been able to also retain control over many of the villages west of the city. And so nothing will really advance until that situation is dealt with. But what I wanted to say is that the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, they have turned it into a garrison, a hub that can last for a really long time throughout the entirety of 2025. That is the Ukrainian objective. They would like to freeze the line of contact over here, That's what they ended up doing in the earlier portions of 2025, and that's the situation up to this day. And the Ukrainians are also working on backup lines north of Pokrovsk. And throughout the month of March, they have been able to significantly expand these defenses. So this doesn't just include trenches, but actually, in many cases, the majority of the work, the majority of the excavations are actually of anti-tank ditches. And this is a bit of an issue. In some cases, you have three lines of anti-tank ditches, just one after another, running along, for instance, the E50 highway, or running basically perpendicular to it. Sometimes also along chains of villages. And throughout March, we saw both expansions of previously built trenches and unifying them, and also improvements, improving their width, improving their quality more generally, making them suitable, conducive for long-term stay, and then creating totally new lines. For instance, this one over here in Dnipro, which starts in Vesele, which is actually in Kharkiv. So really, it is one that spans a wide chunk of the border and makes it all the way to the eastern entrance into Mezhova, which is a very important town. So this is actually a really vital Ukrainian development over the past couple of weeks. The issue is, as I said, the fact that they're building so many anti-tank ditches is not really reflective of the frontline situation in some of these regions. Because, as I said before, throughout 2025, we have not seen that many Russian armored assaults in this region. We saw them occur over the past week in an area that they stockpiled armored vehicles for and advanced through open regions. But the same can't be said for the Pokrovsk region. We have not seen any armored vehicles used en masse, any sort of columns. It's usually infantry based assaults. And so there's less logic behind building an anti-tank ditch or building up a vast amount of sometimes dragon's teeth. Obviously, it's pretty cheap and doesn't take that much time to lay them all down, the foundation for them, but those resources could all have been directed towards building up trenches. The issue with trenches is that then you need the manpower to actually stay there and turn them into an effective defensive sort of obstacle. But even with the overemphasis on anti-tank ditches, you do still have a huge chunk of these defenses being built as trenches, meaning that even if Pokrovsk falls, the Ukrainians have several layers of defense northwards that, given the fact and given the opportunity to actually man them properly, will be able to protract fighting for an extended period of time. And that's also why the Russians have shifted focus southwards. They don't want to deal with the attrition involved with that and the sort of slogfest. And so they're sort of forfeiting for the time being their attention from this region and looking at an area where there actually are more opportunities for deep assaults and deep penetrations. And you can see how these defenses extend all the way up to the next sort of hub and next city in Donetsk that would have very similar role to Pokrovsk, and that would be Dobropilia. And so the Russians are beginning to now strike on a really regular basis some of these key cities with cabs, with MLRS fire, high caliber guns, targeting Krasnopilia, Dobropilia is another example. Various other cities like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk have also reported similar levels of just heightened shelling and just incessant attacks on a daily basis. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Let's move on to the Kharkiv region. There's something I never mentioned, and that's the fact that the Ukrainians took back the town, or hamlet, I should say, of Nadia. This is an area that the Russians have not really put an emphasis on in recent months. The Russians were able to take over Stepi and then infiltrate into Kopanki. And this, coupled with Nadia, actually presented them an opportunity to advance further southwards along the Kharkiv-Luhansk border and take over a lot of the nearby villages from north to south that are pretty small in size, given the fact that they are actually located east of some of the unified defense lines built by the Ukrainians that are actually pretty unified, pretty cohesive. But the Ukrainians took advantage of the lack of movement, lack of resources dedicated to here. And the third separate assault brigade, Azov, they took back Nadia. I think that was March 16th. I just was not around when that happened because they released the footage a couple of days later. The Russians also captured this area, including a ditch and some open fields north of Ivanivka. And this is a territory that amounts to 10 square kilometers captured, but again, largely open in nature. And that's actually it when it comes to the frontline updates. But I do want to talk about two things. First of all, the United States did announce sanctions on, and it's not really accurate to say that it is a Russia-based sanction. It actually has more to do with the Houthis because a lot of the people involved with sanctions, they are Russian companies or Russian assets, Russian holdings that are in some way tied to the Houthis, according to the Treasury Department. And so this includes two Afghan brothers who are rather rich, and they are apparently involved in financing Houthi operations and smuggling them millions of dollars. And that's done with Russia being a conduit. So that's really what the center of the sanctions package is. The Treasury Department is accusing some of these Russian nationals, and a lot of them are also dual nationals, and these various, you know, Russian wallets of helping finance Saeed al Jamal, and he's supposed to be this Houthi financier who has close ties to Russia. So that's generally the objective, as it's coming in parallel with the American strikes on Yemen that are occurring now on a daily basis. But it also comes amidst the backdrop of claims by Trump that he would launch these 25 to 30% tariffs against countries that buy Russian oil if they don't show any sort of good faith in negotiations, and if Trump holds Putin responsible for basically abandoning the peace talks and being the reason, the culprit behind their disillusion. And so that proposal by Trump that he talked about 3 days ago, by now, I haven't seen any elaboration on it. And that's because obviously that would have huge implications for countries like China and India, and basically every single uh, country outside of some Western ones. And the United States is still a major trading partner with various Asian, African countries. The list goes on, but I would say that is largely unrelated to the current sanctions that were launched against some Russian assets because of the Houthis, because that is an entirely different domain. And the United States is obviously dealing with its own foreign policy objectives in those regions. Then, when it comes to the situation with NATO, certain countries, and the ones that are mentioned most are the United Kingdom and France, they're supposed to be meeting with top military officials and trainers in Ukraine. They're supposed to be discussing a strategy and a blueprint for a peacekeeping force after the war is over. That's been sort of key point, that it would be after a conclusion of fighting. And Zelensky talked about three domains in which peacekeepers could be of assistance, including in the Black Sea, because he would hope that there would be these European military vessels patrolling the Black Sea. That's what he sort of imagining. Also air patrols, and then also ground troops. And so there's actually a contingent of 30 countries led by the UK and France that are involved in these talks. It's not just about peacekeeping, it's more so about how these countries, and it's largely obviously EU countries, NATO countries, and then a couple of other ones like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, how they can sort of increase and ramp up the aid to Ukraine without the United States getting involved, and then also how they can help in the day after the war. So that's generally the sort of framework for the discussion, and that's supposed to occur on Friday. So we'll see if they're able to get to any sort of like new developments, because in recent days, whenever there's been some sort of meeting in Europe between Ukrainian officials and either NATO diplomats or EU diplomats or specific diplomats from each country, there have not been any specific commitment given by those European nations. Obviously, there's financial commitments on a small scale, like the aid that France announced a couple of days ago. I think it was like 2 billion euros, something of that sort. But nothing that actually changes the status quo in any meaningful manner, especially when it comes to discussions of how peacekeeping can be implemented. So that's something that the Ukrainians would really hope to change in coming meetings. But that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.